On the afternoon of the 25th of July 2000, Concorde flight AF 4590 sounded the death knell of supersonic flight. At the time, there was very little accurate information available. Air France wouldn't divulge any of their particular secrets. So they sued Continental Airlines, but lost on appeal. And you can ask why. What was the effect of the runway resurfacing? And what effect did that have on the crash? Why did the Sydney Olympics matter? And was any one person to blame? My thanks first of all is to Ron Spencer for his magic with the slides. Now, British Airways Concorde. What I'm going to do is talk to you first of all about Concorde in general, and then talk about the particular events on that day when the AF Concorde crashed. This talk is designed for people who are not perhaps aeronautically literate. So it's a general talk, and most of you will know far more than I do about Concorde and about flying. So if there's any problems, please accept it for the time being and ask me at the end. And this particular picture is the only picture of a Concorde flying at supersonic speed. And as you can see, it was taken by an RAF Strike Command Tornado aircraft. Otherwise, the aircraft was far faster than any of the attack aircraft available to any of the military services. So we're going to talk about Concorde and particularly the AF 4590, but first let's look at the birth of supersonic flight, which will have occurred in your lifetimes. You will all remember Chuck Yeager and the Bell X1 aircraft, and that was in 1947. So I can remember it just, well, sort of, but some of you will remember that very well. And the question was at that time, can we arrange for passenger carrying aircraft to fly faster than the speed of sound? Up to that point, the only people who'd gone faster than sound were by accident in some of the Spitfires in a long dive and occasionally in other aircraft. And they found it was almost impossible to control the aircraft. And it wasn't until they got into the Vulcan bombers that they learned how to design the wings. And people said, well, if we can carry bombs in a Vulcan, why can't we carry passengers? And so in Britain and in France, they started looking for an aircraft that would fly people. 62 meters long, which is about 9 cricket pitches, and 26 meters wide, which is 4 cricket pitches wide. So it's a big aircraft. And the point of balance on these aircraft was exactly below the main landing wheels. 79 tons plus 108 tons payload. And that is quite important with what happened later on. So we look at it, and those of you who've flown in Concorde will realize how narrow it was and how small. The ceiling height was only 6'5". So some tall people really had to duck as they went down, even in the centre part of the passageway. The width was only 8'7". That's not very wide, just enough to get in 4 seats across with a narrow aisle. And there were 25 rows of seats, so you had 100 passengers. Cabin crew was 4, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, and the flight deck was 3. So it was quite a narrow aircraft. And if you look on the flight deck, you must remember this is, of course, before computers came in. So the flight engineer had the major task. He had just an eyeful of dials. There were no computers at all. This aircraft was designed in March 1969, the first one flew, and it didn't come into service until 1976. But in the late 60s, of course, we weren't using computers. It was all dials. There's the captain and the co-pilot at the front, and the flight engineer, and a jump seat on the left. So what we're going to do is look at just some information. Although the unladen weight was 79 tons, the maximum taxi weight, and this is quite important, is 187 tons, maximum takeoff weight 185. It burned 13.2 kilograms per kilometre, which meant that at takeoff it was burning 75 kilograms per minute. Very, very heavy use of fuel. And the other thing that is important is that the engine thrust, although you could go forward at 150 kilonewtons just on takeoff with all four engines working, you could put it through the barrier, it buggered the engines up, but you could get 169 kilonewtons with the emergency afterburners. If you used them, then the aircraft had to go in for a complete refurbish, but it was possible. The other thing was that the degree of rotation was very important, that like all aircraft you've got a certain degree of rotation, but you had tail dragging problems if you went any steeper than that. Brian Trubshaw did the test flights in the late 60s, and he said that the aircraft became almost uncontrollable if you got more than 52.4% aft loading behind those rear wheels. And he was at the Empire Test Pilot School, and I met him there when I was stationed there for some time. The previous dental officer on that particular station had encouraged local young ladies to come and meet the test pilots, which were from all over the world. And he was using the medical centre and the emergency beds as a, and so it went very well for a year, but then he got picked, someone told on him, and so he got moved and I got moved back in. And I got a lot of gentlemen who were doing test flights saying, well, where were the girls? And there were a lot of girls actually turning out looking for a little bit of extra cash. And it was quite an interesting time whilst I was there. I was just a young flight lieutenant at that time. However, let's look at this Air France flight on the 25th of July. 100 passengers. These passengers were Germans, and they were already on their way on a first-class flight. They were going to go to New York, and then they were going to go down to the New Orleans, the big Mardi Gras. Thank you very much. The Mardi Gras. But then they were going to go on a cruise and on to the Sydney Olympics. And so they were going to take all their clothing with them. And they had lots and lots of heavy baggage. There was no limit given to them on the weight of baggage that they were allowed to take. Before we get to that actual detail, let's just look at the Charles de Gaulle Airfield, 25 kilometers northeast of Paris. It's a very large airfield with 4 runways, and the ones we're interested in are the southern 2 runways here. 26 right, and it's actually 08 left, because this is the landing runway. This runway here, the takeoff for the Concorde, measures just on 2.6 kilometers, sorry, 2.6 miles now. At that time, it was slightly shorter, and they would, at the time of the Concorde, this particular flight, they were lengthening the runway. And some of the runway was still being finished, and it hadn't got its top surface on, so that the runway itself was still in the under tarmac. And the one we're particularly looking at is one way here, this 26 right here. No problems at all. The standard wind in this area was always from the left to the right, so people always took off this way. Very occasionally, very rarely, the wind would blow from the northeast, but mainly it's from the southwest. And in particular, we're going to look at these taxiways here. Instead of coming right to the end of the runway, because this area was under reconstruction, there was a taxiway there, and the one we're interested in is taxiway Romeo. So here we are, Foxtrot, Bravo, Tango, Sierra, Charlie. Airframe just under 12,000 hours, landings just under 4,000 hours. Now all these Concordes had a long history of tyre blowouts. The tyres couldn't take the landing stress very well. At takeoff the tyres were rotating 23 revolutions per second. And the rubber, which was made by Michelin and also by Dunlop, 2 sets of tyres, couldn't really take it. And the tyres would shred, particularly if they hit a bump or something like that. But the largest piece that ever was known to take off from the tyres was about half a kilo, about a pound. And this had happened a lot of times. There's been a lot of them, and British Airways decided to put in mudguards. They said the mudguards here were for stop water spray from wet runways, or if the runways had a slight amount of snow. Air France decided not to put in the guards over the main landing wheels. I'd said that these people were the Germans who were on this holiday of a lifetime. Flight engineer had said, we have got too many bags. We've got about 19 large bags, excess. I don't want to put them on to the rear where the cargo bay is. The front cargo bay is full. I don't want to put them on the back because they are very heavy, and I think that they will unbalance the aircraft. We're already at the point of balance at 52% aft. But the captain said, no, put them on, it'll be all right, don't worry. So he put on 19 bags, and these bags weighed something over 40 to 50 kilos each. And he was putting them on right at the back. But unknown to the captain, the loadmaster had put on board already a large box which weighed 600 kilos. And he didn't tell the air loadmaster, and he didn't tell the captain. So this was already at the back, and then they stacked all these bags on behind. The captain, for some reason that no one has yet explained, also was concerned about the fuel. And he decided to fill up both the rear tanks here, tank 11, and the tank above the main wheels there, tank 5, instead of normal 85% full, to allow a little bit of airspace for shocks, he filled them up to 97%. In fact, the one at the back, he topped it off. He gave deliberate instructions to the refuelers to top the tanks off. So the tanks had no airspace whatsoever. The extra load, the extra mass, was between 2 and 3 tons above the wheels, and no one's yet reported on how much went into the back tank, but they think it was another 2 to 3 tons of fuel. So the aircraft was way overweight, and already the load balance was far too far aft. Now, Charles de Gaulle Airport here is 25 kilometers northeast of Paris. At 20 kilometers northeast of Paris is the old French main airport, Le Bourget, and in between the two is a little town which has grown up to service both the airports, La Gonesse. So the aircraft would be flying directly that way towards La Gonesse, over Le Bourget, and then out on its trip to New York. So here we have the aircraft all ready to go. The tanks have been filled, and what the captain then did was he was very worried about the load. He actually knew that he'd overloaded the aircraft. And he started pumping from tank 11 at the back through to the tank above the wheels. But this tank 5 was already full, so it wasn't doing anything. But he'd opened up all the valves and tried to pump fuel. you are strictly forbidden in this particular airfield from pumping fuel while you're taxiing or you're taking off. But he overrode that. It's an obvious thing that if you're pumping fuel, you can get a spillage onto the runway anyway. So he overrode that, and that was one problem. The other thing that had happened was that the aircraft had just gone in for a service, and it had done 2 flights since the service, but during the service they had replaced the whole of the main landing gear, but they had forgotten to put in an important spacer which held the wheels apart. It's like a supermarket trolley, they wobble, and for some reason Air France engineers forgot to put the spacer in. It was not visible from the outside, you couldn't see it. Once all the wheels were back in, you couldn't see that the spacer was missing. And for the first couple of takeoffs after the service, everything was fine. But there was this missing spacer, and no one knew about it. They did find it later, hanging up in the service hangar, and it was a big metal tube about this long, which held the wheels separately. So nobody knew about that. So the holes in the Swiss cheese are beginning to mount up. Go back to the runways. Now, the aircraft, that Air France aircraft was held for half an hour to 3/4 of an hour because there'd been a problem with the reverse thrusters. And so the aircraft was actually running very late, 3/4 of an hour late. And when they came to taxi to take off, they were told, first of all, that the wind had changed direction and had been, in fact, on and off all day, but had changed direction and was blowing from the northeast to the southwest. And the captain was advised to take on fuel enough so he could taxi this distance to the southern end of the runway and then take off in the abnormal direction, that's this way. But then just before he said, oh look, I've got fuel on board already, I'm all right. And they said, well actually, as it happens, the wind's changed direction, it's now in its normal position, the normal direction, the wind is blowing from 08 left along here, and so we would like you to take off here. The loading on the for the passengers is just nearer the north end of the runway, and so in taxiing out to his takeoff, instead of using up 2.5 tons of fuel, he'd only used they think between 700 and 800 kilos. So he still had an enormous amount of fuel left on board. Also what had happened was that other aircraft, because he was out of sequence, other aircraft were queuing to take off, and there were 3 aircraft waiting to take off. Then what happened was Jacques Chirac, the French president, had come in from an overseas trip to Japan, and he'd landed on runway 08 right, here. And he was asked, he said, "Sir, would you like to see your Air France Concorde take off? We can arrange it, although it's 4th in the queue, we will arrange it so it's head of the queue." So he said, "Yes, please, I would like very much to say that." So they taxied him up on a little, there's another taxiway here, and they parked the 747 with Jacques Chirac on board, just near, off this 08 right, but near to 26 right. And he was waiting to see, and they said to the Concorde pilot, "Look, what we want you to do is to please, could you take taxiway Romeo and come in on the main runway. And instead of going right to the end of the runway here, would you come in through taxiway Romeo?" Now, taxiway Romeo was one of the taxiways that hadn't been completed, and it hadn't got its full surface on board, and it was just rough. the basement that was down, but it was a very rough surface with bumps along the taxiway. And Jacques, the captain, said, "Yes, okay, I'll do that, but I'm a bit concerned that I've now got very much less runway to use to take off." And they said, "No, it'll be all right. It'll be all right. You do that. You'll go ahead of the other aircraft, and there's Jacques Chirac waiting to see you take off." In bumping over the taxiway Romeo, they think they actually moved the wheels. So instead of the wheels being in their normal position, this is the main landing wheels, they'd started to wobble. And it was very noticeable. You could see it from one of the parked aircraft who was waiting to take off. They could say, I could see that the wheels didn't seem to be in their right position. He was watching, and he had a photograph of it. And that photograph has gone missing. No one can see it now. And as soon as he got onto the main runway, he said, "Look, I'm having difficulty." He was down about here. "I'm having difficulty in steering. The aircraft seems to be pulling across to the left very heavily." So what happened then was that he said, "Well, all right." The co-pilot had said, "Look, sir," and this is you can see it's in French, but you can hear it. He said, "Look, I think we should stop. We should go back. There's too many things going wrong." And Captain Marty said, "No, it'll be fine. It'll be all right. Don't worry." Look at that. So what we're doing here is it's not that particular airfield, but what he'd done, instead of the aircraft queuing here, ready to take off, he'd come down this taxiway Romeo. This is not the actual one, but it gives you an idea where he was and how far down the runway he already was. Now, he was overweight by something like 4 or 5 tons. He'd got problems with his steering, and he'd got problems with the also the load of the aircraft. Put this in. The Continental Airlines had just taken off from that very same runway 5 minutes beforehand. And on that Continental Airlines, someone had fitted a piece of metal over the engine bays. That fell off, and it fell off onto the runway. It was well off to the left-hand side of the runway, out of the main track. No one had spotted it. The people in the tower didn't see it. No one did it. They didn't even send a Land Rover or whatever vehicle they used down to check for foreign objects on the runway, because they had such a queue of aircraft taking off. So this piece of titanium metal lay just out of sight down on the runway. Later it was found, this is the picture of it on the side of the runway, exactly that size. It's not very big at all. People expect it to be a lot bigger, but that's the size of the metal. So, duties of flight deck officers. As you well know, this is for general population. The decision for no-go or go for V1 depends on the velocity, the mass and the distance. The captain had reported incorrectly the mass of his aircraft. He was told that you can't take off with a Concorde more than 185 tons. He was well over that. Some people say up to 7 tons over, but most people think 3 to 4 tons over. So he had permission to take off from the South Tower at 1400 hours, 42 minutes, 31 seconds alpha is Greenwich Mean Time. He immediately said that he was having problems with steering. And he had such intense problems with the steering that the Concorde actually came off the runway to the left and broke some of the side landing lights that were on the side of the runway. He was way off to the left. He missed the 747 with Jacques Chirac on board by 2.4 meters, 8 feet. And the captain of that aircraft thought that the Concorde was going to hit him. It was that close. He got to V1, and V1 he had only got to, normal V1 was 150 knots, and he'd only got to 148 knots, 145 knots. He called V1, and that was low, even for a normally weighted aircraft, and it was very late down the runway. He should have stopped. He had enough room to stop. He had 1 mile, and it took 1 mile to stop a laden Concorde doing that particular speed. But he didn't, he chose to continue. They ran over the piece of metal, and it cut into the tyre, and a large chunk of tyre came off, weighing just over 4 kilos, 4.5 kilos. That's the same weight as a human head. It came off at a very fast speed because the aircraft was already turning, and the wheel was turning at 23 revolutions a second. These are 4-foot landing wheels. And it probably came off at about 300 feet per second, 325 kilometers an hour. It didn't penetrate the tank, but it set up a pressure wave. He was already and had continued to pump fuel from tank 11 at the rear of the aircraft through to tank 5. So tank 5 was already full. All the valves were open to allow the pumping into tank 5, but the shock wave of a full tank sprung open the emergency valve on it and allowed fuel to come out. The fuel came out in a large gush from that. The piece of rubber that had come off the tyre had also, as it had gone up to hit the tank, had severed the wiring, which is the undercarriage wiring, and that started sparking and set fire to the fuel. British Airways later said, how is it that a piece of metal that big can cause that piece of tyre to come off? And they ran over the tyre at that speed a couple of times, several times. Nothing happened at all. The tyre just ran over it. But as soon as they put the tyre skidding, as they were, and you can see the black marks on the runway on the runway 26 right, where it had been skidding, then it cut into the tyre and the piece came off. So it would have been all right had it not been for the loose wheel and the fact that the aircraft was already way off to the left of the runway, running over that piece of metal. Otherwise, had it gone down the centre of the runway, it would have missed it completely. There would have been no trouble. There was consternation on the flight deck. So the tyre here was burning. This is just another picture of a tyre. Those tyres are 4 foot tall. They're big tyres. They're spinning very fast, right at the limits of their ability. Consternation on the flight deck. The flight engineer said, I have fire in number 1 engine. I'm shutting it down. There was no fire in number 1 engine. What had happened was that the piece of rubber coming off and the fire had burnt through the wiring to number 2 and number 1 engines, and so it came up on his board that he had a fire in both 1 and 2 engines. There was nothing wrong whatsoever with number 1 engine. There was nothing wrong with number 2 engine, except it was sucking in flames and giving reduced power. The captain said, what have you done? It's number 2 engine. So the flight engineer tried to re-spool number 1. And that takes several seconds for a large engine to re-spool up from having been had an emergency shutdown. Number 2 engine, the captain said, and it's again, you can hear it on the reports, shut down number 2 engine. And the engineer did that. he should really have kept number 2 engine going. Most of you, I think, and I was taught this, even if you have a fire in an engine at takeoff, you keep it going as long as you can, as long as it's still giving some power, because you need it. So at this point, Concorde had both number 1 and number 2 engines out of action or giving very little power on the left side. Then there came the problem, of course, that he was overloaded at the back by several tons. It was worked out later that he was something like 55% aft loading. So the aircraft not only had the problem with the lack of 1 and 2 engines, but he was tail dragging. And thereafter, it just got worse, and things, they didn't know what to do. He was told to try and land at Le Bourget, but he said, no, I am unable to retract the undercarriage. The message, try for Le Bourget, and at 50 seconds after the start of roll, engines 3 and 4 also lost power. So he was effectively had no power at all, very little power. It hit the ground, tail first, and killed seven people on the ground, and everyone on board died. Crash occurred at 59 seconds, 14 hours, 43 minutes, 59 seconds, and it was just impossible. There was nobody who could be saved. This is the official Air France report on the crash. It says basically that the aircraft ran over debris on the runway, it blew a tyre, and into the landing gear bay. All they said about the fuel tanks was they were unusually full, and resulting from the lack of airspace caused rupture, fuel pouring out. Yes, that's true. Debris flew in, the power wiring sparked, making it impossible to retract the gear as the aircraft climbed. They weren't worried about the gear retracting at all. That was nothing to do with it. It could have flown quite happily with all the gear down if the engines were still running. The sparks ruptured fuel tank. It didn't. The fuel tank was never penetrated. It was just the shock wave. And then they said the reduction of thrust from engine 1 and 2. No mention at all about the engineer shutting down the engines. And it made it impossible to control the aircraft that it crashed. So it was nothing to do with any of the pieces missing in the landing gear, allowing the wheels to wobble. Nothing to do with the pilot saying overfill the tanks to 97%. Nothing to do with the weight of the aircraft and the incorrect location of it. It was all just pure accident. They sued the Continental Airlines, but Continental Airlines said, look, no, our piece of metal, yes, it was wrong. It shouldn't have been there, but it was way off the runway. It was nothing to do with us. If you look at the reports from Air France, you'll see that basically they are maintaining this. If you look at the reports from other people, including the British John Hutchison on the BBC documentary, and the book by Andrew Brooks, which was published in 2002, you will see that there's a very different story, the one I've told you today. Thank you.